The weight of the bank statement hit me like a punch to the gut. How is it that after all these years of putting in the hours, biting my tongue, and trying to please everyone, I was still the one left holding the bag? "This is your responsibility," my parents had said, as if it were just another chore on the endless list they expected me to tackle. My older sister? She had it easy. Never had to worry about the mortgage, the utilities, or any of the stress that came with being the stable one in the family. No, she was free to collect rent from the tenants who lived in the house we grew up in, a tidy sum that she never once had to share. I had always thought family was about fairness, about working together to make things right. But fairness, it seemed, was an illusion. The longer I paid the mortgage alone, the more I began to feel like an unpaid employee in my own home. My sister, on the other hand, sailed through life with minimal effort, pocketing rent money without a second thought. What did I get in return for all the sacrifices? A house that felt more like a weight around my neck than a place of comfort. I could feel the resentment building as I scrolled through the latest bank statement, the figures blurring together in a sea of numbers that somehow seemed to mock me. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the years I had spent wondering why things were this way and what I could have done differently. How did my parents think this was fair? Why had they let my sister off the hook while I struggled to keep up? Then the audit came. At first, I thought it was just another bureaucratic checkup, one of those routine things they do for tax purposes. But the results, well, they were anything but routine. What came to light changed everything I knew about my family. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one who had been kept in the dark all these years. The truth was more complicated than I had ever imagined. It was one of those late-night realizations that clawed at the edges of my consciousness, refusing to let go. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that settled like dust in the corners, heavy and suffocating. I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, my eyes scanning through the paperwork again. My mind raced, trying to connect dots that had never seemed to line up. Something about the way my parents treated me, the way they dismissed my questions, was always off. But I couldn't put my finger on it until now. Growing up, I was always the responsible one. My parents would call me the mature one, the one who could be trusted to handle the tough stuff, whether it was taking care of the younger kids or keeping the house together while they were at work. It was a role I never questioned, because it was expected of me, and I wanted to be a good son. But as the years wore on, I started to feel like the role was wearing me thin. My sister, Emily, on the other hand, was the carefree spirit. Always charming, always the one who could get away with a laugh and a smile. My parents indulged her in ways I could never understand. She was the one who took dance lessons and weekend trips to the beach, while I stayed home and helped my dad with the yard work or made sure the bills were paid. My parents never saw it as unfair. In fact, they saw Emily as the light of the family, the one who could keep things easy and fun. And I was the practical one, the one who made sure things didn't fall apart. The mortgage, however, was a turning point. After my parents had moved into a smaller apartment, they asked me to help them out with the mortgage on the house. It was a family decision, they told me. They were getting older and wanted to downsize, but the house needed upkeep and someone to manage it. They needed a stable person to handle the finances and keep everything afloat. Naturally, I was the one they turned to. Emily, of course, wasn't involved in the decision. She lived in a city apartment and didn't have the means to contribute. But that didn't stop her from receiving the rent money from the tenants that lived in the house we once called home. I didn't mind at first. It seemed like a fair enough arrangement. But as the years went by, I started to notice the disparity. The mortgage payments were huge, something I had to scrape together each month. Meanwhile, Emily was pocketing rent money every single month. It wasn't a small sum. She didn't have to pay for the house, didn't have to deal with the upkeep or the stress of it all. Yet, every time I asked about it, she would shrug it off, her smile a little too innocent. "It's just the way things are, right?" she'd say, almost as if she were trying to make me believe it was my choice to bear this burden alone. The resentment started building quietly at first, then more openly. It wasn't just the money. It was the feeling that I was being taken for granted. That my parents had chosen to overlook the fact that I was shouldering the financial burden while Emily got off without lifting a finger. The worst part? I wasn't the only one who saw it. I could tell my friends and coworkers noticed the strain I was under. But when I mentioned it to my parents, they dismissed my concerns. "You're fine," they'd say. "You're a responsible adult." But how was I supposed to be responsible when I was left to deal with everything? Emily, in contrast, was treated with kid gloves. If I even tried to bring it up, my mom would cut me off, saying, "Emily's just helping in her own way, and you know it's not about money." The turning point came when my parents decided to get an audit done. At first, I thought it was just routine, some random tax audit that everyone had to go through. But when the results came back, I knew something was wrong. There were discrepancies. It was subtle at first, just a few odd numbers here and there, things I hadn't noticed before. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. My parents had been hiding something. The rent money Emily had been receiving from the tenants? It wasn't being used to cover the costs of the house like they had said. It was being funneled into a secret account, a separate account I never knew about. I remember the shock I felt when I found out. It wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal. All these years, I had been paying the mortgage thinking I was doing my part for the family. But Emily had been getting a significant portion of the rent money, and my parents had been quietly siphoning it off for themselves, all while I was left in the dark. It felt like a sick joke. The revelation hit me hard, and the walls that had once felt secure now seemed fragile. My relationship with my sister was always strained, but now it felt impossible to repair. She had known about the account, of course. How could she not? She had been the one to collect the rent each month, after all. And when I confronted her, she acted like she had no idea what I was talking about, even though she'd been the one receiving the money. "Don't make this more complicated than it is," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that only made my anger flare. "It's just how things worked out." But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about trust, about feeling like I had been taken advantage of for so long, and that my parents had used me as their fallback plan. The weight of their betrayal sat heavy on my chest, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I had been manipulated into believing that this was somehow my responsibility all along. My sister had never had to ask herself these questions, never had to face the burden of paying for a house that wasn't truly hers. She had been allowed to sit back while I bled out every month, drowning in obligations. And my parents, who should have known better, had allowed it to happen, using me as a tool in their game of convenience. Now, with the audit exposing the truth, things could never go back to the way they were. What I once believed was an arrangement between family members had been nothing more than a manipulation, and it was time for the truth to come to light. The question now was what I would do with that truth, and whether I could ever forgive those who had let it happen in the first place. The truth of the audit gnawed at me relentlessly. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been living a lie for years. What was supposed to be a simple arrangement between family members had turned into a web of deceit and manipulation. Emily, my parents, none of them had ever really cared about the sacrifices I had made. They had all made their choices, and I had been the one to bear the burden. I sat in the same chair that night, staring at the audit report that seemed to mock me from the table. The discrepancies were clearer now, more evident with every read-through. It wasn't just the amount of money Emily was pocketing, though that was bad enough. It was the fact that my parents had known about it the entire time. They had lied to me. And what hurt the most was that they had justified it as some sort of family decision, as if I had agreed to this, when, in truth, I had never been given any choice at all. The next few days were a blur of frustration and anger. I tried to focus on work, to put all of this out of my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I saw my parents or my sister, I felt a growing resentment. My sister, who always seemed to have the perfect life, the carefree smile, the lack of responsibility, she had never once acknowledged the weight I carried. I had always thought of her as the fun one, the one who could do no wrong in the eyes of our parents. But now I saw her for what she truly was, someone who had taken advantage of me, of my willingness to help, and used it to her advantage. I couldn't help but wonder if she had always known about the secret account. Had she been aware of the money being funneled away from the house? Of course, she had. She was the one collecting the rent. And yet, when I confronted her, she denied everything. "You're overreacting," she said. "This is how family works, don't you get it? We all have our roles. You're the one who takes care of the house, and I take care of the rest. That's just the way it is. I could feel my blood boil as she spoke, as if she were speaking down to me. I was the one paying the mortgage, taking care of everything, and all she had to do was collect a few checks from tenants she didn't even know. And now she had the nerve to act like I was the one in the wrong for questioning it? The more I thought about it, the more the anger began to build, and it wasn't just directed at Emily. It was my parents, too. My mom, who had always said she wanted to keep the family close, keep everything equal, she had known. She had known all along that Emily wasn't paying a dime for the house, while I was buried in debt trying to keep things afloat. And yet, she hadn't said a word. My father, who was always so quick to call me the responsible one, had stayed silent. They had let me suffer, let me be the one to handle everything, while they played the role of the loving parents. I needed answers. I needed to confront them, to make them see what they had done. But the problem was, I didn't know where to start. I had been conditioned to believe that family came first, that I had a duty to protect and support them, no matter the cost to myself. But now, I was beginning to realize that their version of family had been a facade, a carefully crafted narrative that kept me in line while they benefited from my sacrifices. It was during one of these late-night sessions, sitting at the kitchen table, fuming over the bank statements, that I decided I couldn't let this slide any longer. I had to confront them, had to lay everything out on the table. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the way they had treated me all these years, as if I were nothing more than a tool to be used when it suited them. The confrontation happened a week later, after I had gathered all the documents, all the proof I needed. I called my parents and asked them to meet me at the house. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I was done staying quiet. When they arrived, the atmosphere was tense. My mom, as always, tried to ease into the conversation with her usual warm smile, but it didn't work this time. "What's this about, son?" she asked, her voice laced with concern but not a hint of guilt. I pushed the audit report across the table toward her, my hands trembling with anger. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "Why didn't you tell me about the account? Why didn't you tell me Emily was getting all this rent money while I was the one paying the mortgage?" My mom's face shifted slightly, but she quickly masked it with a forced calmness. "We were trying to keep things simple," she said. "You know, keeping track of everything so no one had to worry. Emily's rent money was supposed to cover other expenses. It's just that things got a bit complicated over the years." Complicated? I could hardly believe the words coming out of her mouth. Complicated? I've been carrying this weight for years, paying the mortgage, handling everything, and you tell me it's complicated. My father, who had been quiet until now, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Son, we didn't want to burden you with too much," he said, his voice weak. "You've always been the responsible one, and we didn't want to put more pressure on Emily." The words stung. More pressure on Emily? My sister, who had never once been asked to contribute, was the one being protected? And I, who had been bending over backward to keep everything together, was left to shoulder the burden alone. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, feeling my voice crack with frustration. "How long have you been hiding this from me?" "Longer than you know," my father muttered, looking away. "But we never thought it would come to this, son. We didn't want you to feel this way." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. They had known, and they had kept it from me. They had let me believe that I was the only one holding up the family, when in reality, they had been making choices behind my back. I turned to my mom. "And Emily?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What about her? Does she even know about the account?" My mom hesitated. "She knows," she admitted, finally looking at me. "But she didn't know the full extent of the financial situation, and we didn't want her to worry. She's always been so carefree, so," she trailed off, searching for the right words. I couldn't believe it. "So you just let her keep the rent money and never told her it was supposed to go toward the house?" "We thought it was fair," my dad interjected quickly. "We thought it was a way for Emily to contribute, in her own way. But I wasn't buying it anymore. It's not fair. It's never been fair. And you've been using me to make up for your mistakes." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence in the room. I could feel the weight of the years, the resentment that had been building, settling in the pit of my stomach. The people I had trusted most had failed me in ways I never imagined. And in that moment, I realized that things couldn't go back to the way they were. There was no going back. The truth had come out, and it had broken everything wide open. The next steps were clear. Nothing would be the same again. The weight of the conversation hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. My parents sat there, their eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and deflection, unable to meet my gaze. I had just torn apart the veil of family loyalty that had kept me tethered to this farce for years. But the real storm, the one that would change everything, was still on the horizon. And I could feel it gathering, pushing the air tight around me, making it hard to breathe. "Is this what you wanted?" I asked, my voice louder now, the frustration breaking through. "To keep me in the dark while you let Emily skate by without ever feeling the consequences? I've been living under the illusion that I was doing what was best for the family, but all you've done is manipulate me. You used me as your safety net, and Emily, she's been benefiting from my sacrifices all along." My father shifted in his chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, as if the truth was choking him. My mom's eyes were glossy, like she was on the verge of tears, but I couldn't feel sorry for her. Not now. Not when I was the one left holding the pieces of this shattered family dynamic. "We didn't know how to tell you," my mom finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "We didn't want to burden you. You've always been so good about handling things, so reliable. We thought this was just a phase, and you'd be okay." "Okay." The word exploded out of me. I stood up abruptly, pacing around the room, my anger surging like a tidal wave. I've been living like this for years. Every month, I've scrimped and saved, trying to keep the house from falling apart, trying to make sure you didn't lose everything. And all the while, you were letting Emily take the rent money and never once asking her to contribute. Why? Because it was easier? Because you thought I'd just suck it up and do the right thing? My mom stood up too, her voice becoming pleading. "Son, you don't understand. We didn't want to burden either of you. You were the one who had the means to handle it. You were always the one who could take on more, do more." My father let out a sigh, rubbing his temples. "Look, this wasn't an easy decision. We were trying to balance things, trying to make everyone happy, and sometimes we got it wrong." "Got it wrong?" I repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. "This isn't just a mistake, Dad. This is a betrayal." A beat of silence passed between us, the air heavy with unsaid words, but I wasn't finished. I couldn't stop now. "And Emily," I said, my eyes narrowing as I turned toward her. "You've been living a lie too. You've known about this all along, haven't you? You've been pocketing money that should have been used for the house, and you've been pretending like you had no idea what was going on. You've played the role of the innocent one, the one who had it all figured out, while I was the one picking up the pieces." Emily was silent for a long moment, her face a mask of deflection. But when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know everything," she said, her tone not quite as innocent as it once had been. "But I knew you were struggling. I knew you were paying the mortgage. And I didn't know how to ask for help." I scoffed, my heart racing in my chest. "You didn't know how to ask for help? Or you didn't want to? Because, clearly, you never had to. You just got to walk away from all of this. It was easy for you. Too easy. I didn't want to make things worse, okay?" Emily's voice cracked, the first sign of vulnerability I had ever seen in her. "I didn't know how to fix things. But I wasn't trying to hurt you." I shook my head, feeling the anger and hurt welling up inside me like a flood. "You weren't trying to hurt me? You let me carry the weight of this family on my back for years, and now you expect me to believe you didn't know what was happening." The words stung, and in that moment, everything I had held back finally came pouring out, all the pent-up frustration, resentment, and hurt I had bottled up for so long. It was no longer just about the money, it was about how they had treated me. How they had treated all of us. My father, who couldn't even look me in the eye anymore. My mother, who pretended like everything was fine while pulling the strings behind the scenes. And Emily, who had never once had to ask herself what it felt like to be invisible in a family that favored everyone else but you. I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting, like everything I had known was suddenly unrecognizable. My family, the people I had spent my entire life trying to protect and take care of, were standing there, helpless and broken, but not broken enough. Not broken enough to make me feel like things could be repaired. In that moment, something inside me snapped. The years of resentment, the weight of their expectations, the betrayal, it all crystallized in my chest, and I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything would be okay, that I could continue carrying this burden without losing myself in the process. This stops now, I said, my voice low, but filled with a finality that left no room for argument. I won't do this anymore. I'm done. I could see the panic in my parents' eyes. My father opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to silence him. I'm not doing this for you anymore. I'm not carrying the weight of this family when I'm the only one who's been honest about my role in it. And Emily, I turned to her, the words heavy, I'm not going to fix this for you either. I've been trying to hold it all together for so long, and now it's time for you to face the consequences. For once. There was a long silence as they absorbed my words, as I let the reality of my decisions settle into the room. I had made a choice. It wasn't an easy one, and it wasn't one that I knew would be understood right away. But I knew I had to take a step back. I couldn't be the one to save them anymore. The truth had come out. And now there was no going back. The family I had known had fractured beyond repair, and it was up to each of us to pick up the pieces. Whether or not we ever healed from this, whether or not we could ever find a way to forgive each other, was something that could only unfold in the days to come. But for now, all I knew was this: I had drawn a line in the sand, and I wasn't going to cross it again. I was done. The days after the confrontation felt like a quiet storm had passed, leaving the dust to settle, but the air still thick with tension. I spent the next few weeks in a haze of mixed emotions: relief, anger, confusion. The sense of finality I had felt in that moment of decision was something I had never experienced before. For the first time, I wasn't living in the shadow of expectations, of family obligations, or the guilt that had once weighed me down. But despite the clarity I had gained, the aftermath was anything but peaceful. My parents, once pillars of support in my life, were now distant and withdrawn, their roles in my life no longer clearly defined. They were trying to apologize, trying to make things right, but I knew deep down that things could never go back to the way they had been. The trust had been broken, and while they may have been sorry, it wasn't enough to erase the years of resentment I had buried. They hadn't just betrayed me financially, they had betrayed me emotionally. They had turned a blind eye to the pain I had endured for years, never once acknowledging the weight I carried for the family. I remember sitting with my mom in the kitchen, a week after the confrontation. She looked at me, her face tired, the years of unspoken guilt etched in the lines around her eyes. I never meant for it to go this far, she said quietly, her voice filled with regret. We should have told you. We should have trusted you to understand. I looked at her, trying to understand what she meant. But the truth was, I was no longer sure I could trust her or my dad the way I had before. It's not just about telling me, Mom. It's about the choices you made. About how you used me to fix everything and how you let Emily take the easy road. I was the one left to pick up the pieces. You can't just apologize for that. Her eyes watered, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. She was a mother, trying to make amends, but I knew the damage had already been done. I know, son. I'm so sorry. But please know that we didn't want to hurt you. We didn't know how to ask for help either. I could see the sorrow in her eyes, but something inside me had changed. I wasn't the person I had been before that night. I wasn't the one who would bend to family pressure, pretending like everything was fine. The anger and disappointment still lingered, and I wasn't sure if it would ever go away. But in that moment, I understood that while forgiveness might come one day, it wouldn't come overnight. I had to take the time to heal, to distance myself from the weight of their actions, before I could even think about rebuilding our relationship. Emily, too, reached out to me after the confrontation. Her message was hesitant, unsure, but there was something genuine in it that made me pause. She asked to meet. The idea of facing her again made my stomach twist, but I agreed. When we sat down, it was awkward at first. The familiar dynamic between us was gone, replaced by the new reality of our fractured family. "I know I've messed up," Emily began, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I never realized how much you were sacrificing. I thought I was helping in my own way, but I didn't understand the full picture. I'm sorry, and I want to make it right." I had expected a defensive response from her, denial, perhaps, or even an attempt to shift the blame, but instead, I saw something raw and honest in her expression. She had always been the carefree one, the one who never seemed to feel the weight of responsibility. But now, sitting across from me, I could see the cracks in her facade. For the first time, she seemed like she understood what I had been going through all these years. "I don't know if things can go back to the way they were," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We can't just pretend that everything's okay. It's going to take time." "I know," she said softly. "But I want to try, if you'll let me. I want to help fix things, even if it takes time." For a brief moment, I thought about what it would take to rebuild any kind of relationship with her. But I knew it wasn't going to happen overnight. The years of resentment, of being overlooked and disregarded, couldn't be undone by a single conversation. But maybe, just maybe, it was a step in the right direction. Over the next few months, I focused on myself. I set boundaries with my parents, not out of anger, but out of a need for space. I couldn't keep being the one to fix everything for them. I began to explore what it meant to live for myself, to make decisions based on my own happiness rather than out of obligation. I took time off from the house, from the financial strain, and used the time to think about what I really wanted for my future. As for my parents, we didn't talk as often as we used to, but we were learning how to navigate this new reality. There were no more silent resentments between us. They were trying, in their own way, to make amends. And while I wasn't sure we would ever be the same, I realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe some things weren't meant to go back to the way they were. Maybe the only way to move forward was to let go of the past and accept that people change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. When Emily came to visit one weekend, we sat together in the house we had once shared as a family. The house that had felt so heavy with my responsibility now seemed lighter, as though the weight of my past sacrifices had finally begun to lift. We didn't talk much, but there was an understanding between us. We had both been wrong. We had both been lost in the web of expectations and misunderstandings that had kept us from seeing each other clearly. But in that silence, there was a shared acknowledgement that we were taking the first steps towards something new. I realized then that the family I had once known was gone, but maybe that wasn't the tragedy I had thought it was. Maybe the real tragedy was in holding on to a version of family that no longer served me, no longer served any of us. And as I began to move forward, taking small steps, setting new boundaries, forgiving where I could, I felt the weight of those years of sacrifice slowly begin to fade. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I felt free enough to find out. And that, in itself, was a victory I had never imagined I'd achieve. The house, once a symbol of burden and resentment, had transformed into something more neutral. I had come to see it as just a house, not a place where I was trapped in obligations, but a space where I could choose my next steps. The mortgage was still there, the debt was still real, but for the first time, I wasn't carrying it alone. It wasn't about running away or abandoning my family, but rather learning to live for myself, to live in a way that didn't come at the expense of my own well-being. As I sat at the kitchen table, alone with my thoughts, I realized just how much I had changed. I had spent so many years trying to make everything work, trying to hold the family together when they didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. But now, I understood that strength wasn't about sacrifice, it was about knowing when to let go, when to stop fixing what wasn't mine to fix. My relationship with my parents had shifted. We still spoke, but there was a distance now, a space that allowed for honesty. They no longer saw me as their safety net, the one they could rely on to keep everything from falling apart. And as painful as it had been to confront them, to strip away the layers of family myth and expectation, it had opened the door for something more real. We weren't perfect, and I didn't expect perfection. But for the first time, we were dealing with the truth. Emily, too, had changed. The carefree, oblivious sister I had once known had evolved into someone more self-aware, more willing to take responsibility for her actions. It wasn't easy, none of this had been easy, but the willingness to change, to admit her faults, was a step toward healing. I wasn't sure what the future held for us, whether we could ever be as close as we once were, but the possibility of a new beginning, grounded in truth, felt more than enough. In the end, the lessons I learned weren't just about family, money, or betrayal. They were about knowing my own worth, about choosing to live authentically rather than being trapped by expectations. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I was walking it on my own terms, and that was enough.